Hello, everyone. It's me, David Chen, here on the YouTube channel at youtube.com/DaveChensky, as well as on my Patreon page at patreon.com/Dave Chen. Today, we are going to be discussing What If Episode 6, which is about what if Killmonger rescued Tony Stark. We're going to be spoiling everything through this week's episode. And joining me, Dan Gvozden. How are you doing today, man?
I'm doing all right. I'm happy to be doing this, although at a different time. I guess due to my own issues, I won't get into. So those who are tuning in
We had
live,
some schedule. Don't leave people a dangling thread like that, Dan. We had some scheduling issues, and that's why we're doing it the next day. But yeah, this is a conversation about what if. We're going to spoil everything. We're going to recap everything. And patrons at patreon.com/Dave Chen will get a audio podcast version of this conversation. Now, there's been some debate in recent weeks about whether we'd actually continue doing this podcast because the numbers for the YouTube show are literally the lowest out of any of the YouTube recaps we've done. And I think it's just because my guess is because of week on week engagement with the show. It doesn't need to be as high as for the other shows.
right?
But here's the problem: is I just really enjoy talking with Dan Gvozden about this stuff, and so if we can find an excuse to do it, if we can find time to do it, we're going to do it. That's kind of where I am right now on it. So
And I feel like as the show goes on, there's just less and less to say unique about it. Like the concept has kind of like settled in at this point, and now we're just getting like Marvel Mad Libs.
yeah.
And I think this episode is probably the best indication of of that, or a representation of that.
Yeah. So I mean one comment I want to remark on from last week is somebody commented on our last week's episode and said like, you know, that our expectations are too high for the animation, basically, right? That like, we have said some kind of backhanded complimentary things about the animation style of the show, and that someone said like, haven't you seen other animated TV shows? This is just as good as those, and I think that's actually right. Like the animation style is very similar to shows that like appear on the air week to week, or of that sort. I think I will say I think WandaVision, Falcon and Winter Soldier, and Loki really did set a bar for production values for TV shows. Like, regardless of how bad at least one of those shows was, the what you cannot deny is that they looked good. All three of those shows looked good,
Right.
and so I was like, I think What If is a show looks pretty good, but it also the animation style also has a lot of limitations when it comes to expressiveness. We've already identified this in previous episodes, and I was kind of curious, like, are they going to use this as an opportunity to like really expand what's possible for animation on television? I don't know that they really have. Again, I think it's a great looking show. It just is not necessarily groundbreaking in terms of style. What do you think, Dan?
Well, I think we're going to see a lot of growth out of this. I mean, I think it's been a decent enough success that I expect that we'll see a ton more animation from Marvel, and I'm eager to see where this grows. I guess for me, the thing is that I feel like it operates in an uncanny valley, which is it's just close enough to looking like all the actors, and
Uh huh.
I actually think like Michael B. Jordan's Killmonger in this looks like eerily accurate to Michael B. Jordan. Or maybe it's just that he's such a handsome person that he
Mm-hmm.
translates well to
Yeah.
kind of this more like blockier style. I almost wish it was more abstract, and the focus could have been more on bringing the animation to life rather than like right now it feels to me like kind of lifeless like dolls on screen,
Uh
and
huh.
I don't know that I needed it to look that accurate. Like I would happily have traded that level of detail for more expressiveness, and I also think that the show itself is really a dialogue heavy show. Like it's really for any guff that we give it, yeah, there's a lot of action, but so much of it is focused on the characters' faces interacting with each other and emoting that to me that should have really been at the forefront of like how they chose to invest, what kind of animation style they went with. So
Well, I think the
yeah,
style they chose really benefits action scenes. Like,
yes,
I think the action scenes look awesome in the show, and I think the style they chose allows them to do really dynamic, robust things, and I feel like there's a lot of kineticism to the action scenes that it really is in keeping with that style. So there are advantages to it as well. But I agree, like it's very dialogue heavy, it's very feelings heavy, and I do think we do see some limitations of that. Okay, and by the way, if you're listening to this, you've probably already realized that we are not the type of recap show that is just gonna run down, all the cool things that happened in the episode and talk about how awesome it is. We might have some critical thoughts, and that's nowhere gonna be more evident than in this episode of the recap podcast. Because Dan Gvozden, this episode, what if Killmonger rescued Tony Stark? Uh, I think this is the first outright bad episode of the show.
Hmm.
Is how I feel about it. Like all the other episodes. I've been like, okay, like there've been some good things, there've been some bad things. This is the first episode I've been like, this is just a bad episode. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I just want to start with the concept, which, like, what if Killmonger rescued Tony Stark? I guess, I mean, I guess I wasn't asking for a lot of the other ones either, but this feels like really far afield. Like, I don't know how those worlds interact, and maybe that's the joy of it, but I wasn't asking for what if Killmonger rescued Tony Stark. I feel like there are so many other what if stories that like immediately spring to mind. Like just say, for example, like what if the other half of the universe was snapped or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I feel like here you're really beginning to see in this episode how the format of the show is really becoming like apparent to the point that I feel like a lot of these episodes exist solely to get us towards whatever team up we're getting, which is apparent now because there was a trailer that was released this week for the rest of the season and showed all these heroes together, if you want to call them heroes. Um, and this one to me felt like a random team building exercise or like origin story just to get us to that point. And instead of being a compelling narrative on its own. And I think there are interesting things in this, um, but it felt more like an exercise than it did trying to tell a story.
I remember like I always have so much admiration for anthology series because the idea that you need to tell a story with a beginning, middle, and end in a 20 to 30 minute time period it just is so challenging to do. And I think some episodes of What If have actually done a really good job of that. The first few, I think, for instance, like largely respected that idea. But in the last couple, like last week's, I think, right, the zombies and this week's, uh, it's now clear that that's not the format they're confined to, right? They're potentially two parters, or there's gonna be a team up or whatever. By the way, on that note, a lot of fun last week when we couldn't figure out what the hell was going on with Thanos and why he was in Wakanda in last week's episode. And there was actually somebody who commented on that episode that I thought was very kind to us, and they're basically like, uh, "You are right to be confused about Thanos because the reason he was in Wakanda in the first place was to get the Mind Stone."
Right,
Right. So why would like in Infinity War? That's why he went to Wakanda was to get the Mind Stone. So
right.
why would he be in Wakanda if the Mind Stone wasn't there? Maybe he knew it was going there. Anyway, suffice to say, there were a lot of twists that needed to occur. Like a lot of mental somersaults needed to occur.
And if you want
Um,
to see two people just dumbfounded trying to solve it, check out last week's
that's what you can
episode.
get. That's what you get. I mean, go to Screen Crush's Ryan Airy if you want extremely polished, cogent, intelligent thinking about this. Come to this channel if you want just two nerds like completely befuddled at what's happening. You know,
Yeah, well, look, Ryan Airy's not doing it live, you know?
I mean, like, he's not doing it live the day after. Or 2 days after, Dan. He's in fact actually pushing those videos out approximately 8 hours after the episode debuts. So
We don't need to bring that up, David.
no, no, we don't. No. Seriously, though, Ryan Airy, super talented guy, huge fan. Hopefully, will be a guest on this channel at one point. But he does a great job, and we are doing something extremely different than what he's doing. Let's just put it that way. We're not even trying to be what he's doing. So
So David, I want to know why this is so bad because like I thought it was like probably my least favorite, but not so far afield from some of the other ones I didn't love.
here is why this is so bad. Okay, first of all, I would say this episode had more actors that were not the original actors in the lead roles, and that was very noticeable. So let's do our recurring segment. Rank the performances of the actors that were in this episode. Okay? So here's who was in the original that was in this episode. Okay? Michael B. Jordan played Killmonger. And I thought the performance started out kind of weak. Like when he was at the press conference, it was kind of like, this sounds like he's recording this in his bedroom and not particularly enjoying it. But then as the episode went on, I thought it really grew into its own. So I actually thought he did a good job as himself. John Favreau was Happy Hogan. We got Chadwick Boseman playing T'Challa again. Angela Bassett played Queen Ramonda in this episode. And Denai Guerrera played Okoye. They got Andy Serkis to play Claw. I actually didn't think it was Andy Serkis at first. I thought it was someone doing an Andy Serkis impression, but nope, that was him.
I was very pleased with that. I thought it sounded great. But I mean, that's Andy Serkis for you.
Don Cheadle played Rhodey, and then Paul Bettany played Jarvis. Leslie Bibb played Christine Everhart. Okay, so John Connie played T'Chaka. I think he was in the original as well, right? Yeah. So he played T'Chaka. And then the people who they got to replace people from the movies, Mick Wingert played Iron Man, or Tony Stark. And I'm sure Mick Wingert is a very talented guy, but this performance I thought was all of these next ones I'm about to name all felt like imitations that were very mannered, and it's kind of like if you wanted me to do an impression of Robert Downey Jr., you would reach for the most like sardonic and wry kind of quippy elements of that persona, and I feel like that's what came out in the performance. What do you think of the Tony Stark in this episode?
I agree with that. I feel like I mean, it's slightly off. You know, there's moments where you can catch him really like getting that Robert Downey Jr. thing, but for the most part, it's like a little more like high pitched and nasal. And part of my brain was thinking like, oh, well, this is just like the guy that kept remaining. He never became a hero, and he was kind of weaselly, and so I kind of leaned into that a little bit in my brain to accept it. But it isn't him, and it's a decent enough impression, but it's not quite as convincing as say like the Josh Keaton doing like Captain America.
Uh, Kif Vandenheuvel played Obadiah Stane, not Jeff Bridges. Curious if you had any thoughts on it. To me, same issue that I had with the Tony Stark performance. What do you think?
I mean, it's such a minor role
Yeah.
that like he had what is maybe like 3 or 4 lines. It didn't stand out to me as like anything totally distracting because he's just so briefly in the episode.
I guess Jeff Bridges was able to imbue that role with like his cantankerousness so memorably that it's hard to hold a candle to that, in my opinion. So Kif had a challenging task, but yeah, it was a relatively minor role. Beth Hoyt played Pepper Potts.
Distractingly different than Gwyneth Paltrow.
Well, again, I still feel like it was like kind of an impression, and this brings me to my last one. Ozioma Akaga played Shuri, replacing Letitia Wright in the movie, and that's the only one of these that I felt was actually successful because it was really different. It was like not even trying to be what Shuri was in the movie, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It was also like a very different conception of the character, as far as I could tell. Like Shuri in the movie, Letitia Wright in real life is 27 years old. In this episode, it made it seem like she's kind of like a teenager almost, right?
Well, this is like years before we met her in Black Panther.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
So it's like a very different. Like it wasn't like I was watching someone do a Shuri impression. It was just like this is a completely different phase of life for this character, and so for that reason, it's the most successful. So, uh, number one about this episode, the voice acting just felt kind of like a mixed bag. I think it really does. It's distracting because some of them are the originals and some of them aren't, and I'm always kind of like in this uncanny valley situation of trying to figure out which is which. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean the Iron Man performance is like half the episode,
Yeah,
and he probably speaks more than Michael B. Jordan does, because
yeah.
that character is relatively quiet. So,
Okay, but
yeah,
why was this episode such a fail for me personally? It's the combination of all these things. It's number one, what you're saying about like, wow, what an extremely random premise, of which there are potentially other more interesting premises they could explore. Number two, it's the fact that this is not a self-contained story, when like part of the reason this show is appealing to me at all is like that you're going to keep these as having their own like self-contained arcs, and this is clearly tying into something else, which is, you know, I was hoping that it wouldn't be that. Maybe like every episode from this point on is not going to be a self-contained story, and I'm not going to be into the show anymore, or I'll be into it even less. Um, and then number three, the ending is just so rough. Like,
so rough.
what I mean by that is, in general, you do not want the audience to be ahead of the characters in the show, right? Uh, you do not want the audience to feel like, oh, like I am smarter than the people in the show. They should not be doing the thing they're doing. And the problem with the ending of this episode is, not only do you already know that Killmonger is going to betray them,
Right.
because, but even if you didn't know, you would still suspect that. Right? Like, even if it wasn't revealed to you the state of Killmonger's plan, if this guy just showed up and was like, hey, the strategy is let the killer robots inside the walls of the city, you would say, that's madness. Get out of here. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul. But instead, they're like, yeah, okay, let's try this. And then you have Shuri, who's like the audience surrogate, being like, guys, this is a terrible plan. And like, no one's listening to her, even though she's clearly the smartest person. That's just like frustrating storytelling. Do you know what I mean? So, and then it doesn't even end. So I'm just like, okay, whatever, show. That's kind of my reaction to this one. So,
Well, that's the thing that's been building up for me is the non-ending endings. I feel like we kind of got this throughout the whole show, but they were handled more elegantly up to this point.
mm-hmm.
This one just ends. Like it's just over. There's no.
Right.
I
At
mean,
least with the Thanos like showing up, it's kind of like there's some kind of shock value in that. Like,
right.
per what we discussed 5 minutes ago, like not a fan of it, but at least like there's some value in being like, aha, like a magician being like, woohoo. But this is just like it just abruptly. It feels like they cut to a commercial break and never came back, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it could be that this is like the first one to have kind of like I don't know if I would dare say optimistic ending, but like most of the endings have been like, oh no, the world is now over, or about to be over, or some big looming threat, and it gets your mind kind of reeling. And this one's just like, here's another like almost positive wrinkle in it.
Yeah.
And yeah, for me, the bigger thing was I felt like this is the first show to really bungle like its timeline within the MCU.
Mm-hmm.
Like so many of them have been fairly consistent, or at least rethought it in really interesting ways. And this one to me felt like it had a looser grasp than the others. I mean, from like literally the second Killmonger shows up and hurls a missile into the sky when he's just a normal powered human being. Like I'm like, wait, what? Like I remember him being that powerful after he drank the Black Panther
Yeah.
like serum, but I don't know how he just decided to chuck this thing into the sky and he's just that dude. To even down to the T'Challa is Black Panther in this episode. Like if you remember in the movies,
Yeah. Plot Twisted asks, why was T'Challa Black Panther? Shouldn't that have been his father?
right, because his father was Black Panther and then gets killed,
Right.
and that's what causes him to take up the mantle. And it's like, okay, but he's still alive here. Um, And then there's interesting things that are different than the movies that I would chalk up in like maybe the good column, which is after Eric slash Killmonger drinks the serum in the movie when he
By
when
the
he
way, Mike V in the chat is pointing out that he was already Black Panther before he was king in Civil War. His father retired from being Panther when he got older. So like,
oh,
so
I guess we didn't
yes,
see that.
because
I had forgotten that
I think
detail.
Black Panther, he's already Black Panther in Civil War. So the events of Black Panther I think actually take place before Civil War, right? Is that right? Anyway,
Yeah, I thought he took the serum in the Black Panther movie, but
he did, but I think that takes place before his father's killed, which is in Civil War.
right, okay.
Got yeah.
I guess I need to revisit that movie.
Come on, Dan. You're the one that's supposed to keep me on this, man.
Well, sure, sure. It's early, I guess. I don't know. But there is an interesting moment where after Eric drinks the serum, he gets to go to like the Undying Lands
Yes.
or whatever. And in the movie, he doesn't ever get to go there because he has kind of
Right.
like attacked his way in and stolen and burned these crops, and he instead visits his own kind of like mind palace, if you will, where he's like he sees his father, and you realize he's so hung up on this thing from his past. So I thought it was interesting here that he got to go and like visit T'Challa and the other Black Panthers. I guess maybe because he was like appointed into that role instead of having to steal it. And I thought that was an interesting wrinkle here.
Let's talk about some of the other cool things about this episode, of which there are a handful.
Sure.
Um, so I just find it an inherently interesting creative exercise to recreate the events of the MCU in animation form. It's just like, oh, it's cool to be able to see them. And so we see like the opening of Iron Man 1. And then, of course, you start hearing the guy speak as Tony Stark, and it's like, it's very different and that's jarring. And I'm like, oh, it's weird that it's not, it's not Robert Downey Jr. But I always just am a fan of like them recreating certain things from the MCU and seeing like how they would reimagine them in animation form. Uh, let's see. I thought the design of the drones was kind of cool. Pretty not sleek or elegant, but very Gundam esque. And we find out that Killmonger is a fan of anime, so that's nice.
They look a lot like the drones from the ending of Iron Man 2, if you remember that
Mm.
movie. That Whiplash and oh my gosh, I'm forgetting his name right now. The Sam Justin Hammer create at the end of Iron Man 2. I thought that was kind of like maybe I don't know if it was intentional, but it definitely seemed similar to that to me. On the note of Iron Man 2 as well, I was curious to see Don Cheadle here as Rhodey.
Yeah,
In the events of Iron Man 1, similar to what we got with Bruce Banner, a few episodes ago. This kind of like recasting of the past. I mean, it makes sense to do it, but it's always kind of a bit weird to see.
I need to go back on the thing I just said 2 minutes ago. This is such a mess. This episode is such a mess. This recap that we're doing right now. um, DJ Taylor in the chat points out that Black Panther takes place a few weeks after Civil War.
Right.
Now, according to this article at Forbes I'm reading, when Black Panther begins, the film implies that just a week has passed since the events of Civil War, with T'Challa literally watching a live news report of the events of that film. However, the official timeline retcons this to make Black Panther take place a whole year after the events of Civil War, which is problematic because as T'Challa only becomes king in his solo movie, this timeline would mean that he left Wakanda without a king for a whole year. A way to resolve this would be to say that Civil War took place near the end of 2016 and Black Panther near the beginning of 2017, thus making the difference just a few months. But this is an odd amount of time to leave the nation ungoverned. Okay, anyway, point being, it's confusing. And
I would say if there's one thing I'm the least invested in, it's where the exact timeline falls for the MCU. Like there were a lot of people that got really upset about like Spider-Man: Homecoming, and the date that movie was suggested to be at it not working out in the actual timeline, and
yeah,
I could really care less. Like to the point that like the MCU at some point in Endgame was in like 2 or 3 years in the future. and we were seeing like 2021.
Well, this is also an issue with Shang-Chi as well, because theoretically, like Avengers Endgame, like Shang-Chi takes place at the events after the events of Avengers Endgame, which like theoretically takes place in like the late 2020s. And we find out that Shang-Chi was born in like the early 80s. You know, basically Shang-Chi should have been like 45 years old or something like that. If you do the math out of when it was supposed to take place. Okay. Uh so let's move on. I'm sorry that I brought this up at all. And because I'm time constrained, I'm not going to have a chance to edit this whole conversation out, so it's all my bad, Dan. It's all my bad. Okay.
I will forever hold it against you.
So, what else happens in this episode that's cool? I thought it was kind of one of the things that I actually will praise about the What If franchise is they're not afraid to just straight up murder people in the Avengers. You know, like beloved characters in the
Even if
Avengers.
the murders are really odd, like I didn't really understand why Iron Man died by getting pinned through his shoulder.
Well,
Like what?
he bled out, Dan Gvozden.
I have to assume, but they make it so dramatic with that glass dropping and shattering. And, then I was like, I was expecting him to be like gored through the middle, but he's just like pinned by his
No, he's
shoulder.
got to have
And
a final moment.
I,
That's
I,
why he's still
yeah,
alive.
I'll
Yeah.
admit when I was writing the notes for this episode, I was like, Tony is incapacitated, I guess. And then the scene just moved on and he was dead. And I was like, oh, let me go back and edit that because I guess he must have died.
I thought the funeral scenes were actually oddly moving in this episode. The Dora Milaje, taking Black Panther and then like I think Rhodey is also killed in this episode, right?
Correct.
And they kind of like have Rhodey's coffin as well, and there's like the parallelism there. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
And it says in Wakandan text, Wakanda forever,
Mm.
on T'Challa's grave, and you almost wonder, like, I mean, I'm sure along with everybody else, we're all wondering what the heck Wakanda Forever is going to be, the movie. I imagine we might get like a very similar scene to the one that plays out here, because I have no idea how they're going to deal with T'Challa's, death within the MCU. If he dies, that he might be on some extended vacation or
Yeah,
something. But
or like he's somewhere else and we never hear from him again or something. Who knows?
that would be very strange because I imagine it's going to be a big tribute to Chadwick Boseman. But how they handle it will be very interesting.
Gary Yarbrough in the chat says, I enjoyed the timeline. Tony and Pepper were still professional. Shuri was young. Angela Bassett was badass. That is kind of cool, seeing like these characters at a different moment in their lives. And I do respect that I do respect the fact that in general the show respects that, like, if Iron Man never happened, like Tony and Pepper might have never gotten together. Or it deviates from that sometimes. Like with like the Doctor Strange episode, like would he still have become Doctor Strange? We're assuming yes, but like, but then other times it like does respect it, and I think that's cool that it does that. Okay.
I like that they have like Tony making fun of his father's like early plans to build like an arc reactor, and like, oh, that's so silly, and he kind of brushes past it, and that we see the dream of Iron Man just evaporate in one little
Right.
half musing.
Yeah, yeah. So all that's cool. Okay. Here's some of the things I didn't like in addition to the stuff we've already discussed. Number one, I I feel like this show I would dare not suggest what they creatively artistically tackle, because artists should be free to create what they want. I'll just say, me personally, I find it increasingly upsetting the way in which Chadwick Boseman's character is made to be maimed and suffer and die in the show.
Yeah.
Like he was maimed like last week, or was it yeah, I think it was last week's episode. And then in this episode he like dies, and I'm just like, I don't, it's very sad to me that Chadwick Boseman is gone, and so it's a huge bummer. The other thing about this episode is that it's just difficult to watch The fact of Marvel films being military propaganda, in my opinion, is not a disputed notion. Uh, the military is frequently involved in Marvel productions, frequently approves of their depiction in Marvel films, and uh, and watching stuff that's set in Afghanistan, in a way that's meant to be kind of like more lighthearted and what if blah blah blah. After the events of the last month are just kind of also unfortunately resonant for today. I don't know if you felt that at all, but anyway.
Well, I do think, it is slightly critical of the military industrial complex. I mean, not in any way that we've not seen before, but it does, we do get to see Tony Stark like doubling down on that and his original plan of like, he says, I saw my own people killed with, my own weapons. That just means we need to make bigger weapons, and we see the kind of like end game of that, play out where it's just like escalating conflict and pain and people, using this military system for their own gain rather than any kind of real peaceful intentions. And Killmonger kind of exists on that, which is like he is twisting everybody so that he can keep accruing power. To that regard, I don't think it's any kind of like deep, nuanced critique, but it is playing into that theme that started in Iron Man 1, of escalating military power and the kind of damage it can cause. So I
I,
agree with you on the challenge of seeing Afghanistan on screen in any kind of like lighthearted fashion, but I do think the show is being somewhat critical.
I think there's just like hard limits to how critical Marvel can be of the military,
Right.
and part of that is because like the military will likely continue to be involved with the creation of Marvel films, and so and there's a bigger question about to what extent do superheroes help uphold the status quo. The military is often depicted to be good guys in these movies. Uh, Not always, but frequently. So anyway,
My bigger miss, I think, is like how this episode tackles race, and specifically, you were talking about Chadwick Boseman's character getting maimed every episode, but I mean, specifically in regards to like Killmonger's like motives. In the Black Panther movie, there was this whole angle of him feeling excluded from this kind of like black utopia in the form of Wakanda, and how that technology needed to be shared with the world. And he had this very different take on kind of spreading the wealth of that empire with the rest of the world, and how they had been excluding it. And by the end of the film, we see T'Challa kind of come to a similar realization as Killmonger, just through different means, that Wakanda does have a place in the larger world. And I don't feel like this episode really got into any of Killmonger's motivations and what might play out differently here. Like really only Tony is given, that kind of like psychological analysis. Whereas in this episode, it really just kind of seems to be casting Killmonger as, quote unquote evil or really out for revenge of some kind. But we don't get into any of the, thought behind that. And to me, that was what made the character so interesting, is he actually was truly sympathetic for a lot of Black Panther. And here I got like really none of that. There's
yeah,
no
I
talk
agree.
about colonization or
He was one of the
anything.
best Marvel villains in the MCU for
Hands
sure,
down, yeah.
and we don't see that much evidence of that in this episode, and that's kind of a bummer. But all right, Dan, I think we got to actually wrap it up there. Suffice to say, this is kind of a disappointing episode. But we appreciate you sticking by us and going through the emotional journey of watching the show with us. I want to give a shout out to my patrons at patreon.com/Dave Chen for making my work possible. Check out patreon.com/Dave Chen for an audio version of this conversation. And be sure to follow Dan's work at amazingspidertalk.com. Dan Gvozden, thanks so much for joining me today, man. Really appreciate it.
I know it was a bit of a rush, but I had a great time talking to you about it.
Always. See you later.